The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is considered to be one of the best video games of all time. The original Nintendo 64 release sold 7.6 million units, which made it the best-selling Zelda title until it was eventually overthrown by Twilight Princess 8 years later. The game has been re-released on a number of different consoles including the GameCube, the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, so its total sales figures are a little hard to determine, but it's at least 13.82 million, which puts it in second place, only being beat out by the series' most recent installment, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. By all accounts, this game is a masterpiece, but it was extremely close to never leaving Japan. How could a game as legendary and critically acclaimed as Ocarina of Time be so close to being trapped on the island nation? Let's find out. See, when the Nintendo 64 launched, Nintendo was facing a lot of criticism from developers for sticking with the older and more expensive cartridge format for its games. Newcomers like Sony with their PlayStation 1 and rival Sega with the Sega Saturn were all utilizing discs for their games, which, besides being cheaper to produce, also held far more data than a typical cartridge. So, in an attempt to meet the demands of the developers, Nintendo set out to make an add-on for the Nintendo 64 to increase the data limit and add additional functionality. This device was called the Nintendo 64 Disk Drive, or the 64DD for short. The 64DD didn't use optical media like its competition. Instead, Nintendo opted to use a magnetic disc-based media similar to old-school computer floppy disks. This allowed them to expand the storage for games up to 64 megabytes. Still just a fraction of what CDs were capable of, but unlike CDs, this data was rewritable, meaning that games could save data like customization options to the disc itself. The 64DD also added other features to the Nintendo 64 like a real-time clock for persistent game environments and online connectivity so users could buy, download, and share content. It was essentially Nintendo's first step into making a more modern and connected video game console. At its announcement in 1995, the 64DD had dozens of games and applications in development for it. However, there was an issue. The Nintendo 64 wasn't meeting sales expectations for Nintendo. Thanks to a recent interview translated by Tony from the Hard for Games channel, we now understand that Nintendo was delaying the release of the 64DD until sales of the base Nintendo 64 reached around 6 million units. Despite the 64DD's hardware and software being production ready, Nintendo delayed the product for years until eventually releasing it only in Japan in December of 1999, the same year that Nintendo announced Project Dolphin, or as we now know it, the Nintendo GameCube. Due to these delays, when the 64DD did release, most of its major software had already shifted development back to the standard cartridge format. Out of the dozens of software and applications planned, only 10 titles actually released on the 64DD. By all accounts, the Nintendo 64DD was a commercial failure for Nintendo, only selling around 15,000 units and of course, never making its way outside of Japan. By now, you might be wondering how this relates back to Ocarina of Time. Well, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time actually started out as a game intended exclusively for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. If you're an avid fan of the Zelda community, you're probably familiar with Zelda, which was the proposed disk drive expansion to The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. However, what some people may not realize is that Ocarina of Time started its development as a disk drive exclusive game. However, by March of 1997, Nintendo announced that Ocarina of Time had shifted its development from the disk drive back to a traditional cartridge. The reason given at the time was that due to the slower read speed of the magnetic discs, the motion data for Link's animation could not be loaded fast enough, and therefore the fluidity the team was aiming for would not be possible on the disk drive. And while that may indeed be true, it might only be half of the story. As we mentioned earlier, the Nintendo 64 wasn't selling as quickly as Nintendo wanted, and rather than holding software hostages waiting for that magic number, most developers chose to move their disk drive games to cartridges just to get them to consumers. It very well could have been a similar case for Nintendo too. They might have run into issues with the disk drive and realized that it might just be better to move Ocarina of Time to a cart, release it to bolster sales of the Nintendo 64, and worry about the disk drive later. Because it's clear that Nintendo hadn't given up on the 64DD just yet. Even before Ocarina of Time was released, Nintendo had plans to release additional content for the game via the disk drive, and this is where Zelda comes into play. Now, it's widely contested online as to what Zelda actually was. Was it a brand new game using Ocarina of Time's engine? Was it additional dungeons and a continuation of the story? Well, according to Miyamoto, it's something like this. Zelda is based on Ocarina of Time for 64DD. It has the same construction of gameplay. It's very much a parody game based on Ocarina of Time, but with new dungeons to explore. It even features the same storyline. Zelda uses the same system as Ocarina of Time, but uses the 64DD to add game data. The story in Zelda will be similar to Ocarina of Time, but with new maps and scenarios. Nintendo has gone on record several times throughout the years stating that Zelda was renamed to Master Quest, and it's been released at least twice now, both on the Nintendo GameCube and the Nintendo 3DS. A lot of confusion stems around the fact that while Zelda was being worked on, so was another project called Zelda Gaiden, or as we now know it, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. In an Iwata Ask interview, Iwata and Aonuma had this to say: Zelda, what later became Master Quest, was being developed on the 64DD and was ultimately released on a limited edition compilation disc that came with pre-orders of the Wind Waker, no? Ultimately, it was the other staff that ended up working on Zelda. For me though, the person in charge of Ocarina's dungeon design, making alternative version of the game's dungeons didn't seem very progressive. I didn't think we'd be able to call the finished result a new Zelda. However, I couldn't just say no to the idea of making a new one. To that end, I made a bargain with Miyamoto. If I could make a new Zelda game within a year, we wouldn't have to do Zelda. And at the end of the day, Aonuma was able to deliver that new Zelda game, and thus Zelda, or Master Quest, was quietly hidden away until its release on the Nintendo GameCube promotional disc for Wind Waker. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is still a great game, but the slow sales of the Nintendo 64 and Nintendo's constant delays may have drastically changed its development. It's unclear at exactly how much content was cut when the switch from the disc drive to a traditional cartridge was made, but Nintendo has gone on record saying that most of the ideas that were planned for Zelda have at some point made it into future installments in the Legend of Zelda series. Additionally, data leaks from last year that included beta maps, screenshots, and other development leftovers have given us a small window into what it may have been like if the disc drive was a commercial success instead of a failure. That's all for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, a like rating would be greatly appreciated. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. But once again, guys, my name is Matt. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.